They told you not to go into the woods alone, but they never told you why. Because if they did, if they told you what really happened there in the winter of 1906, every night from now on, you'd look over your shoulder before stepping into the dark. Not out of superstition, but because something listens back. The locals called it the silent stretch, a part of the Georgia wilderness where even the birds refused to sing. Men would wander in for timber or solitude and never return the same. Those who did came back pale, trembling, unable to describe what they'd heard between the trees. Some said it was the echo of a woman crying beneath the soil. Others said it was the forest itself, whispering names that didn't belong to any living soul. But the truth was worse than all their stories combined. Because that year, 1906, a surveyor named Elias Granger was sent by the state to map the area. He was logical, trained, a man of reason in an age of superstition. He believed that fear was a symptom of ignorance, until he stepped into that place and realized that silence was not the absence of sound. It was a presence of its own. The first night, his journal entries were neat, confident. Coordinates, weather notes, bird tracks. The second night, the handwriting changed, shaky, rushed, words bleeding into one another. He wrote, "Something followed me," but there were no footsteps. When his body was found 3 weeks later, his compass was still spinning. His eyes were open, but not seeing. And carved into the wooden handle of his axe were the words, "The forest remembers." You see, the world you think you live in, the one mapped and measured, is only the surface. Beneath it lies an older geometry, one that speaks in roots, in echoes, in memory. Men like Elias stepped into places they weren't invited to, and the forest, it collects them. Tell me, if the woods around your home suddenly went quiet one night, would you dare to listen? When the body of Elias Granger was brought back to town, the sheriff couldn't explain a thing. No wounds, no struggle, no sign of animals. Just that strange expression frozen on his face, like he'd seen something ancient and understood it too late. They buried him quietly, but the silence he brought back didn't stay in the ground. That's the thing about truth. Once it's touched the living, it spreads, like rot under varnish. The coroner's report mentioned something peculiar, microscopic ash embedded beneath his fingernails. But there had been no fire in the woods, not for miles. And when the doctor tried to scrape a sample, the ash moved. Like it resisted, like it wanted to stay inside him. Weeks later, his assistant quit after hearing whispers in the morgue. He said the voice sounded like his own, but older, calmer, as if time itself was trying to correct him. Now, here's where most men stop listening, because the story ceases to sound human. But if you've come this far, it means something in you already knows. The forest doesn't just grow, it remembers. An old hunter once told me the woods out there used to be part of a sacred boundary. The Creek elders refused to hunt inside it. They said it was a place where language was first born, where words carried power, and to speak without respect was to unmake yourself. Elias didn't believe that. He used his compass, his ropes, his ink, and walked into what was never meant to be charted. When he disappeared, his final entry wasn't coordinates. It was a question. He wrote, "If silence can think, what does it remember about us?" They found that line smeared in blood, the ink mixed with something dark, oily, reflective. Every page after it was blank, yet under the lantern's light, faint impressions appeared, circles, spirals, shapes like roots twisting into symbols. Those marks weren't random. They matched carvings found on the oldest stones buried near the settlement. Stones that predated any record of man in that region. And the pattern formed an eye. The same I later found burned into the bark of a cedar near where he died. No fire, no matches, just a perfect ring of black wood, like the forest had blinked. Tell me, do you still believe it was just a storm that took him? The government's involvement began quietly, like most dangerous things do. 2 weeks after Elias Granger's burial, a sealed letter arrived from Washington. It bore no insignia, just a single phrase typed across the envelope flap. For authorized eyes only. Inside was an order. The silent stretch was to be surveyed again, but this time by men who did not officially exist. Their goal wasn't to map the land. It was to find what was watching. They sent 3 agents. No names, no records. Just men who'd done the kind of work that leaves a mark on the soul. The locals remembered their eyes, cold, disciplined, like men who'd forgotten how to dream. They arrived with crates of instruments, early sound recorders, seismic gauges, thermal plates. To them, this was science. But they were walking into something that didn't recognize science, only respect. On their first night, they set up camp near the edge of the forest. The temperature dropped 12 degrees without a single gust of wind. Their equipment picked up no animal noise, not even crickets. But on the playback, something else. A low, rhythmic pulse, like a heart, but not human. And beneath it, a whisper repeating the same word. Return. The youngest agent wanted to leave. The eldest laughed. That laugh was the last sound ever recorded from their camp. By morning, the site was empty. Tents collapsed inward, as if pulled by unseen hands. The recorders were still running, their wax reels catching only the faint sound of breathing. Not one human footprint remained. But at the center of the camp, where their fire should have been, lay a perfect circle of smooth soil, as if the earth had been polished from within. When the sheriff went back to investigate, he found their rifles snapped clean in half, metal folded like twigs, and carved into a nearby tree. That same phrase again. The forest remembers. Washington shut the case within 48 hours. All maps of the area were redrawn. The woods were renamed. And for the next 20 years, no one spoke of it. Not publicly. But things buried have a way of surfacing when silence grows too heavy. And in 1928, the silence broke again. By 1928, the world had changed. Machines roared where men once prayed. Electric light had replaced the candle, and with it came arrogance, the belief that darkness had been conquered. But the forest doesn't care for human progress. It waits. It listens. It remembers. That year, a man named Dr. Adrian Cole arrived in Georgia under the guise of an anthropological study. He was no mere scholar. Cole worked for the Institute of Occult Psychology, a government-funded body that operated between science and silence. Their purpose? To understand places where human perception failed. And the silent stretch was on their list. Cole was a man obsessed with pattern. He believed the human mind could only perceive 10% of reality. Everything else filtered out for our survival. He'd spent years chasing anomalies. Haunted towns, cryptic carvings, missing time reports. But something about Elias Granger's journal called to him. It wasn't fear, it was recognition. He'd seen those spiral symbols before, in the margins of ancient Persian manuscripts, in carvings beneath the Vatican archives, in the dreams of patients who'd never met. So, against orders, he went into the woods alone. The air there was wrong. He described it as thicker than time. Each breath tasted metallic, charged, like the space before lightning strikes. His watch stopped within 10 minutes. His compass spun in circles, but the deeper he went, the more he felt watched not by eyes, but by memory itself. He began hearing something faint, almost like the earth murmuring beneath his feet. At first it was incoherent. Then words began to form, echoing softly in his head. Return what was taken. That night, Cole camped beside an old cedar. He lit a lantern, opened Granger's journal, and began tracing the carved eye onto a fresh page. As his pen moved, the wind rose. The trees began to sway, not chaotically, but in rhythm. The forest was breathing with him. He felt warmth on his fingers. Looked down. Ink was running up his arm like veins. He tried to drop the pen, but his hand no longer felt like his own. And then, through the reflection of the ink, he saw it. Faces in the darkness, forming out of the soil, eyes without whites, mouths without sound. They weren't ghosts. They were memories. The forest was remembering him. They found Dr. Adrian Cole's journal 3 weeks later, half buried at the edge of a creek that didn't appear on any map. The man himself was gone. No trace. Not a shred of clothing. Not a drop of blood. Only his field bag. And that journal, still dry, though the soil around it was soaked. When the authorities opened it, the ink looked fresh, as if written hours earlier. The first few pages were ordinary notes, coordinates, botanical sketches, sound frequency charts. But after page 30, everything changed. The handwriting fractured. Sentences broke mid-thought. He wrote of hearing roots beneath skin, of seeing faces form in bark, of voices asking him to remember before remembering was born. Then came something worse. Pages filled with equations. Not physics, not geometry, something in between. The symbols were identical to the spirals from Elias Granger's axe carvings. But here, they were arranged in perfect symmetry, forming what appeared to be a map. Except this wasn't a map of terrain. It was a map of consciousness, a design showing how thought itself bends under observation. Cole wrote, "The forest doesn't remember events. It remembers awareness. We are echoes of something that came before us, and it wants us back." Later pages were written in a language no linguist could identify. But there was one line, in English, scrawled in haste, pressing so hard the pen tore the paper. "The eye is not watching us. We are its dream." Every clock in the laboratory where the journal was analyzed stopped at the same moment they opened it. 2:47 a.m. No power outage. No mechanical fault. Just stillness, absolute. And for 3 minutes, everyone in that room reported hearing the same sound, a heartbeat from beneath the floor. The Institute sealed the journal, labeling it C9, and forbade further study. But as with all forbidden knowledge, someone always looks deeper. A young assistant, Dr. Lila Morton, copied one of Cole's spiral diagrams before it was locked away. She believed it was a cipher, a message hidden inside the geometry. And when she mirrored it, folded it in half, the shape formed the outline of a human skull. It wasn't just a forest. It was an intelligence, ancient, buried, and still expanding. Dr. Lila Morton worked in secrecy long after the Institute had closed the case. By day, she cataloged artifacts. By night, she studied forbidden symbols, lines that seemed to breathe when traced under candlelight. Cole's spiral haunted her. It wasn't just geometry, it was syntax. When folded, mirrored, and rotated, the pattern formed phonetic clusters resembling the Proto-Aryu language, an extinct dialect older than recorded history, predating even Sumerian script. A language scholars believed had never been spoken by human mouths. Morton cross-referenced the symbols with archaeological fragments from Mesopotamia, and one pattern stopped her cold. It was identical to a glyph etched on a tablet excavated near the Tigris River in 1891, a relic that had vanished from the British Museum under unexplained circumstances. The inscription translated roughly to, "The roots remember." The mind returns. The same phrase carved into Granger's axe. The same echo found in Cole's journal. And suddenly, the pattern was clear. These weren't random disappearances. They were activations. Every man who entered the silent stretch was touching something far older than the soil. Something that predated man, but remembered him. Morton's notes show she began hearing the same pulse recorded by the vanished agents in 1906. Low, steady, rhythmic. She recorded it once. At 11:59 p.m. When played back, the waveform revealed an unmistakable pattern. The outline of an eye, perfectly symmetrical. That night, she wrote in her private diary, never published, never submitted, just one entry. They are not trees. They are veins. The forest is a body, and it remembers the ones who built it. Historians dismissed it as hysteria. But the deeper she went, the clearer it became. Ancient Mesopotamian texts described the Garden of Silence, a place where the gods hid the first language, the one that could command creation itself. And legend said it was buried beneath the western lands, sealed so that no mortal could awaken it again. Morton realized the truth too late. The forest wasn't cursed. It was calling. And the reason it took Elias, Cole, and the agents was because they spoke the closest thing to its forgotten tongue. The language of measurement, mapping, naming. Science itself had become the incantation that reopened what was meant to stay buried. Pause. You begin to see it now, don't you? The silence isn't empty. It's waiting for someone to answer. 3 nights after her discovery, Dr. Lila Morton set up her phonograph. A single candle burned beside her notes. Every door locked. Every window sealed. It was identical to a glyph etched on a tablet excavated near the Tigris River in 1891, a relic that had vanished from the British Museum under unexplained circumstances. The inscription translated roughly to, "The roots remember, the mind returns." The same phrase carved into Granger's axe. The same echo found in Cole's journal. And suddenly, the pattern was clear. These weren't random disappearances. They were activations. Every man who entered the silent stretch was touching something far older than the soil. Something that predated man, but remembered him. Morton's notes show she began hearing the same pulse recorded by the vanished agents in 1906. Low, steady, rhythmic. She recorded it once. At 11:59 p.m. When played back, the waveform revealed an unmistakable pattern. The outline of an eye, perfectly symmetrical. That night, she wrote in her private diary, never published, never submitted, just one entry. They are not trees. They are veins. The forest is a body, and it remembers the ones who built it. Historians dismissed it as hysteria. But the deeper she went, the clearer it became. Ancient Mesopotamian texts described the Garden of Silence, a place where the gods hid the first language, the one that could command creation itself. And legend said it was buried beneath the western lands, sealed so that no mortal could awaken it again. Morton realized the truth too late. The forest wasn't cursed. It was calling. And the reason it took Elias, Cole, and the agents was because they spoke the closest thing to its forgotten tongue. The language of measurement, mapping, naming. Science itself had become the incantation that reopened what was meant to stay buried. Pause. You begin to see it now, don't you? The silence isn't empty. It's waiting for someone to answer. 3 nights after her discovery, Dr. Lila Morton set up her phonograph. A single candle burned beside her notes. Every door locked. Every window sealed. She'd spent years deciphering dead tongues. But tonight, she wasn't translating. She was summoning. On the wax cylinder she inscribed a name, one found nowhere in any scripture. Eshtal. The word appeared repeatedly in the Proto-RU fragments. Its meaning was uncertain, but every translation carried the same undertone. To awaken what listens. She steadied her breath and began to speak. The air thickened instantly. The candlelight leaned inward, as though drawn toward her voice. Each syllable vibrated the floorboards beneath her feet. It wasn't volume, it was weight, language with gravity. Halfway through the invocation, the phonograph captured something impossible. A second voice joined hers. Not echo, not delay. It spoke with her, perfectly in sync, matching breath for breath, as if the air itself remembered how the words were meant to sound. Then the recording ended abruptly, not with static, but silence. Absolute, heavy silence. The kind that eats sound instead of making it. When her colleagues found the room the next morning, everything was untouched. Her notes remained on the table, her candle still burning low. But Lila was gone. The phonograph reel sat in the machine, still warm, though the needle hadn't moved in hours. They played it once. Once was enough. Because in the final 2 seconds of the recording, just before the silence, there was breathing. Not Lila's, something larger, something outside the room. The Institute tried to destroy the wax cylinder, but every attempt failed. It wouldn't melt. It wouldn't burn. Under magnification, the grooves didn't spiral outward. They spiraled inward, toward a vanishing center. As if the sound wasn't meant to be heard, but entered. For months afterward, staff began reporting the same dream. A vast forest stretching under a starless sky, and from its center, a single whisper, rising like wind through hollow bones. Return what was taken. You're starting to feel it now, aren't you? That faint hum beneath your ribs, that pulse that isn't your heartbeat. That's how it begins. The Institute collapsed within a month. Officially, it was due to budget reallocation. Unofficially, half its staff had either resigned, vanished, or been declared unfit for service. But there's always one man who doesn't walk away. His name was Major Henry Voss, a former military cryptanalyst recruited during the Institute's final days. He was a man of pure discipline, skeptic to the bone. He didn't believe in curses or ancient intelligences or forests that remember. He believed in patterns. And when he saw the waveforms from Lila Morton's recording, he saw a pattern that shouldn't exist. Because it wasn't random sound. It was code. When slowed to 1/6 speed, the breathing formed harmonic intervals, mathematical ratios identical to the frequencies used in early military encryption. To Voss, that meant intent. Someone, or something, was sending a message. He salvaged the wax cylinder under the cover of night and took it home. His notes, later recovered from his safe, describe what happened next in chilling detail. First playback, no anomaly. Second playback, the lights dimmed. Third playback, felt observed. Fourth playback, heard a reply. He wrote that the reply didn't come from the machine. It came from inside his head. The sound bypassed the air entirely. He began seeing images when he slept. Geometric forests of bone-white trees, each trunk marked with eyes. And beneath the roots, a city, not made of stone, but of thought. He called it the memory below. For weeks, he obsessed over the pattern, tracing every wave, every ratio. He realized the frequencies mirrored the magnetic field map of the silent stretch itself, as though the forest and the recording were one continuous organism. Then, on the night of February 19th, 1930, he played the cylinder one last time. Neighbors reported seeing lights flicker across the treeline for miles. The next morning, his house was empty. Only the phonograph remained, its needle still spinning in air that no longer made sound. Inside his study, carved into the wall, were 5 words burned deep into the plaster. He answered. It remembered him. The house still stands. Locals say if you walk past it after midnight, the trees go silent. The same silence from 1906. The same silence that waits for the next voice to answer back. By the 1950s, the silent stretch had been erased from all official maps. Renamed, restricted, forgotten, at least on paper. But history has a way of repeating itself, especially when governments play with what they don't understand. In 1953, the U.S. Army launched Project Cotter, a classified acoustic research program. Its objective was simple on the surface: to study low-frequency sound as a means of psychological manipulation. The scientists involved called it resonant influence, a way to alter thought patterns using vibrations too deep for human hearing. They believed they were creating something new. They had no idea they were echoing something ancient. Unbeknownst to most of the team, the original frequencies used in their experiments came from a recovered document, one found among the personal effects of Major Henry Voss. His notes, and a single etched cylinder fragment, had been taken by military intelligence after his disappearance. They thought it was encryption. It wasn't. When they activated the sound in their underground facility, 30 miles south of the old silent stretch, the first reaction wasn't auditory at all. It was biological. Moss began growing along the concrete walls within hours. Instruments malfunctioned. Animals brought in for testing refused to enter the room. And then came the dreams. Every researcher began reporting the same image. A forest of white roots stretching into infinity, pulsing faintly, like the earth itself was breathing. The dreams would start silent. Then a voice would whisper the same phrase Lila Morton had written decades before. The forest is a body. The deeper they pushed the experiment, the stranger it became. Blood samples from the lead scientist showed chlorophyll traces. His skin began to react to sunlight. He was turning green, not metaphorically, physiologically. When they finally shut down the project, 13 of the 20 researchers vanished within 72 hours. Their ID tags were later found scattered along an abandoned railway, every metal surface etched with spiral burn marks. The Pentagon sealed the site and classified the event as electromagnetic contamination. But one surviving doctor wrote a final, unapproved report before disappearing himself. He wrote, "The frequency is not sound. It is memory, living, recursive memory. The forest beneath us has begun to wake. Tell me, if you heard a sound you couldn't forget, one that felt like it was remembering you, would you keep listening?" By the third night, something had changed inside that hole. The wind no longer howled, it whispered. It carried a voice that wasn't the earth's, nor any man's. It called Tobias by name. He couldn't sleep. Every time his eyes closed, he saw shapes moving behind the black of his lids, crawling, dragging, reaching. When he woke, he found dirt beneath his nails and the faint, metallic taste of soil in his mouth. By dawn, the ground outside his shack looked disturbed, as though something had clawed its way up, not down. He told himself it was rats, coyotes, the wind. But the whispers grew clearer, speaking of blood debts, of roots that remember, of a seed that should not have been awakened. That afternoon, his neighbor, old Martha Kell, came by with a loaf of cornbread. Tobias hadn't seen another soul in days. But when she handed him the loaf, her eyes darted to the mound of dirt near the barn and froze. Her voice shook. "Tobias, what did you dig up?" He tried to answer, but the words wouldn't come. His throat felt dry, packed with grit. That night, she screamed. The sound cut through the valley like a blade, then stopped all at once. When Tobias ran to her cabin, the door was ajar. Inside, The air was cold and heavy, and her bed was empty, except for a trail of wet soil that led straight to the open window. He looked toward his field, where the hole waited like an open wound. The moonlight shimmered across something glistening near its edge, something alive. It pulsed like breath. Tobias fell to his knees, whispering prayers that didn't belong to any church. And the ground whispered back. By the end of that week, the valley began to empty, not with footsteps, but with silence. It started with the Kell place, then the Myers, then the preacher's boy who used to fish down by the creek. Each house stood open like a pulled tooth, with doors swinging in the wind and lamps still burning inside. Chickens clucked, horses neighed, but no people came out to quiet them. Sheriff Albright rode through on the fourth day. He found Tobias sitting on his porch, eyes hollow, skin grayed with dirt. The sheriff asked him what happened, but Tobias just stared past him, toward the field. Albright followed his gaze, saw the hole. He took one step closer, and the ground sank, just slightly, as though something below had shifted. He spat and muttered, "You dig too deep, Hale. The Lord don't bless what ain't meant to be touched." He rode off that night, but his horse came back the next morning, alone. That was when the whispers began spreading beyond Tobias's shack. The surviving neighbors swore they could hear them in the wind. Voices murmuring from wells, from cracks in the floorboards, from beneath their beds. One man claimed he saw shadows moving under his fields, like something crawling just below the roots, circling, waiting. By now, Tobias didn't eat, didn't sleep. He sat by the window, clutching his lantern, watching the earth breathe. His face looked older, not with years, but with something heavier. And then, one night, the ground outside his house opened again. This time, not a hole, a mouth, a wide, trembling maw of shifting soil and roots, exhaling a slow, damp breath that smelled like blood and rust. And from inside, he heard his mother's voice, soft, pleading, familiar, calling his name the way she used to when he was a boy. Tobias stepped closer. The ground pulsed once, then stilled. The wind went quiet, as if waiting for him to answer. The sound came like a breath drawn through stone. It wasn't just calling his name, it was remembering it. Tobias. The voice rolled from the pit, deeper than any human throat, softer than a mother's whisper, older than language itself. He froze. The lamp in his hand flickered, and for the first time, he saw shapes moving beneath the soil, shifting, folding, stretching, like the land itself was alive, coiling around something ancient trying to wake. "Tobias," it said again, "you were promised." The air thickened. It was no longer night. It was something older, something before time had names. He dropped to his knees, staring into that black, breathing hole, and he realized it didn't just speak his name. It knew it. It knew the rhythm of his heartbeat, the pattern of his fears, the moment he was born. It spoke as if it had been waiting for him. He tried to speak, but his voice broke apart like ash. His lips trembled as he whispered, "Who are you?" The wind shifted. The field behind him moaned. The lantern flame curved toward the pit, drawn like metal to a magnet. And then it said, "I am what they buried before you ever learned to pray." Every inch of Tobias's skin tightened. His chest burned. He felt something move inside him, not around his heart, but beneath it, as though roots were twisting in his blood. He stumbled backward, choking on air that felt thick as smoke. The voice grew quieter, almost kind. "You dug because you remembered. The others forgot. You came because you were called." He fell onto the dirt, trembling, eyes wide with a terrible clarity. This wasn't the first time he'd heard that voice. He'd heard it once before, when he was a child, fevered and dying, when his mother laid him in the field and begged the soil to take his sickness away. That night, he'd lived, but something else had been planted. And now, 19 years later, it had come back to harvest what it owned. By dawn, the voice had gone quiet, but the ground didn't forget. When Tobias stepped outside, the field was slick with dew, or what looked like dew, except it shimmered dark red under the rising sun. The soil pulsed, faintly, as if something beneath it was breathing through the earth. Each step he took left a print that filled instantly, swallowing itself like the ground didn't want him leaving again. He tried to speak a prayer, but the words felt false in his mouth. Hollow. The same prayer he'd heard his father mutter every Sunday. A man who'd smiled in church and whipped Tobias behind the barn when no one could see. The words stuck in his throat like rotten fruit. That's when it hit him. This land didn't forget anything. Not the laughter, not the screams. Every cruelty, every lie, every act of silence soaked into it like blood into cloth. The field remembered him. He looked down, and the dirt moved, curling upward, like hands reaching for his ankles. Beneath the soil, faint faces flickered, not clear, just impressions. The preacher's son, the missing neighbors, and something else. His mother. Her lips were moving, whispering something he couldn't hear. Then he realized it wasn't her voice at all. It was his own, echoing back from the dirt, twisted, reversed, as though the ground were mocking him with his own confessions. He dropped to his knees, pounding the earth, shouting, "What do you want from me?" The field answered not in words, but memories. Visions flashed, men burying things under moonlight, shovels hitting bone, a baby's cry muffled by soil, and a shadow standing behind them all, watching, waiting. The Hale family had farmed this valley for generations, but they hadn't been feeding the land. They'd been feeding something else. He staggered backward, eyes wide, heart cracking under the weight of understanding. The Hale legacy wasn't about survival. It was about sacrifice. Every harvest, every prayer, every blessing the land gave them came at a cost. And now it was collecting its due. The journals came first. He found them buried beneath the floorboards, wrapped in oilcloth and bound with twine. Pages stiff with moisture and something darker, sticky between the lines. His grandfather's handwriting, neat but frantic, filled every page with one repeated phrase scrawled between prayers. "It must eat, or we will." Tobias turned the pages with shaking fingers. At first, it was farm records, dates, yields, rainfall. Then, beneath them, notes of offerings. Small things, at first, birds, rabbits, stray dogs. Then names, human ones. It wasn't madness. It was tradition. The Hales hadn't discovered the thing in the soil. They'd made a pact with it. Somewhere in the fog of time, a deal was struck. The earth would give life, as long as it was fed death. Crops would grow where others starved. Animals would thrive, and sickness would never last long if they buried the right kind of flesh in the right kind of moonlight. The deeper Tobias read, the sicker he became. Whole generations had played their part, pretending to pray to God above while feeding the one below. One passage stopped his breath entirely. "If the soil ever sleeps hungry," his grandfather had written, "it will rise to feed itself." Tobias dropped the book. His mind flashed to the neighbors, their open doors, their vanished faces, the wet red earth. He understood now. The ground wasn't turning against them. It was simply taking back what it was owed. He stumbled outside, wind howling through the valley like a warning. The fields moved in slow waves, the earth swelling, settling, swelling again. Then, from the hole, came a smell, sweet, metallic, and ancient. It filled his lungs like perfume and poison mixed together. His vision wavered. He swore he saw something rising, not fully formed, not of flesh or spirit, but both. A shadow taller than any tree, woven from roots and memory, wearing the faces of the dead like masks. It looked at him, and every cell in his body remembered kneeling before it once before. It rose slow, deliberate, like it wasn't growing, but remembering itself back into form. Tobias couldn't move. The thing that emerged wasn't made of flesh or bark or bone, but a braid of all three, roots twisted with veins, wood fused with the curve of ribs. Faces flickered along its length like reflections in black water. Some crying, some whispering, some smiling, all alive, all wrong. When it spoke, it didn't use a voice. The air around it simply became sound. "You're late." Tobias staggered backward, dirt sliding under his boots. His heart slammed against his ribs, trying to flee before the rest of him could. "What are you?" he gasped. The thing leaned closer, and its many mouths opened in unison. "You know me. You carry me." The words vibrated in his chest, not just heard, but felt, crawling through his bones. He saw flashes again, generations of Hales kneeling in this same field, blood steaming in the night air. A child crying as a shovel was lifted. A woman whispering prayers she didn't believe. And always, beneath them, this same pulsing presence, whispering promises. The soil remembers. The soil rewards. The soil feeds. Tobias clutched his head. He could hear them all now. Every ancestor, every victim, every buried thing the Hales had ever offered. The voices tangled together, some pleading, some laughing, all calling his name. "You're the last root," they hissed. "The final harvest." He felt at his knees, screaming into the storm. "Why me? Why now?" The answer came not as words, but a wave of understanding, that it had waited for this moment, this generation. Because the land had grown too full, the debt too heavy, and he, Tobias, the last living Hale, was the only one left to settle it. The ground pulsed once more, shaking the trees, bending the corn. From the soil, thin tendrils crept toward him, slow, careful, patient, like fingers reaching to reclaim their own. He tried to run, but the land had already decided. The earth doesn't forget its bargains. It waits. It watches. And when the last name of a family line still echoes across its fields, it collects. Tobias ran, or tried to. The soil beneath him shifted, heavy as wet lungs, dragging his boots down with every step. The trees around the clearing leaned in as though listening, their branches quivering, their leaves trembling with some secret hunger. He reached the fence line and collapsed, gasping, covered in dirt that seemed to move on its own. It slid across his skin like oil, into the corners of his eyes, his mouth, his ears. He clawed at it, but the more he fought, the deeper it sank. Then came the voices again, not whispers now, chanting. He looked up and saw them. Dozens of figures in the distance, human shapes made of roots, bark, and old skin. Their faces were his bloodline, the Hales, each one hollow-eyed, expressionless, standing in rows like crops you took from it. They spoke together. You fed it what it wanted, but you never gave what it was promised. Tobias shook his head, crying out, "I didn't know. I didn't ask for this." The figures didn't move. The ground swelled. Ignorance is not absolution. Something tore beneath him, a deep, wet sound like splitting timber, and he was thrown backward as a root burst from the earth, thick as a man's arm, covered in slick, dark sap that smelled of iron and old rot. It coiled around his wrist, his leg, his throat. His body convulsed. Visions poured into him. His grandfather's hand gripping a knife, his father burying something small under a full moon, his mother's tears mixing with rain. Every secret, every sin, every harvest justified in the name of survival. The root pulled tighter, lifting him slightly from the ground, forcing him to face the field. And for the first time, he saw it not as land, but as a living thing. A body. The trees its bones. The crops its skin. The hole its mouth. He realized then that the Hales hadn't owned the farm. The farm had owned them, and it was done waiting. It began with a sound that didn't belong in nature. A deep, rhythmic breathing that came not from lungs but from the ground itself. Each inhale made the dirt rise. Each exhale carried whispers that slithered through the corn like wind made of voices. The air thickened with the scent of iron and decay. Tobias's body trembled in the grip of the roots, his limbs pulled wide like a marionette strung up by something ancient and patient. The earth hummed beneath him, pulsing with an energy older than any god he'd ever prayed to. Then, from the hole, came light, not bright, not divine, but dim and pulsing like a dying star. Shapes moved within it. Human, animal, neither. And then it spoke again. The soil remembers the first seed. You were never a man, Tobias Hale. You were planted. The words ripped through his mind, unraveling everything he believed. He saw himself as a child again, sick and feverish, his mother crying beside the bed. He remembered the night she carried him into the field, whispering prayers to the dirt. He remembered the cold earth against his skin. He had thought she was begging for his life, but now he saw she was offering it. He wasn't healed. He was claimed. His breath broke into sobs. Please, I didn't know. The voice thundered softly, the way the sea might whisper before swallowing the shore. The bloodline fed me. The bloodline grows through you. The roots began to glow, faintly, like veins filling with molten light. They pulsed in rhythm with his heartbeat, faster, harder, until pain became indistinguishable from awareness. And then, from the cornfield, came motion, slow, deliberate. Each stalk bent as if bowing to something unseen. Between the rows, shapes emerged, hundreds of them, human forms made of straw, bone, and memory, each one whispering his name. Tobias looked around, tears streaking through the dirt on his face. They weren't coming for him. They were coming from him. The harvest was not crops. It was Hale blood reborn. And as they stepped into the moonlight, their hollow mouths opened as one, chanting the name that the earth had given him before he was ever born. The field had become a cathedral without walls, without roof, without mercy. The moon hung low, swollen and red, casting its light across 1,000 figures standing in perfect, unnatural stillness. Tobias knelt at the center, tangled in roots that throbbed like arteries, each one pulsing with a dull heartbeat that wasn't his own. He couldn't tell where the land ended and his body began. His veins burned. His skin rippled as if something beneath it wanted out. Then the chanting began again, low, ancient, rhythmic. The sound didn't come from mouths, but from the earth itself. Every vibration in the ground sang with the tone of ritual. The soil remembers the giver. The soil reclaims the given. Tobias's mind splintered between horror and clarity. This was no curse. This was the completion of something written before his bloodline ever built a house or plowed a field. His ancestors hadn't worshipped God. They had worshipped continuity. He felt it now, coursing through him, the terrible serenity of surrender. Every root that coiled around his limbs began to bloom, sprouting pale, fleshy flowers that opened and closed like breathing mouths. From each, a whisper escaped, his mother's voice, his father's laughter, his grandfather's sermons. Each bloom was a memory, each whisper a confession. We fed it because it feeds us. We buried the sinners, not the saints. We kept the fields alive so they wouldn't feed themselves. The words built into a storm, echoing across the valley until even the trees seemed to bow. And then, silence. The ground split open before Tobias, revealing a vast hollow beneath the field, a space that pulsed like the inside of a living heart. Within it moved tendrils of light, weaving through the dark like veins through flesh. He could feel it now, the intelligence, the hunger, the will. It wasn't a demon. It wasn't a god. It was memory itself. Every sin, every death, every buried secret, alive, aware, and aching to grow. And Tobias realized, with perfect terror, that this ceremony wasn't about sacrifice. It was about inheritance. The first crack didn't come from the earth. It came from him. Tobias's back arched violently as the roots dug deeper into his flesh, fusing with veins, wrapping around his spine, burrowing through his ribs like serpents of living wood. He tried to scream, but his throat was already full of soil. The sound came out as a low, trembling moan, half human, half wind. His skin began to change. Pale veins turned black, branching outward like a map of rivers drawn by a trembling hand. His fingertips split, and beneath the nails, small, fibrous threads pushed through, roots sprouting from the flesh. The pain was exquisite, but there was something worse underneath it, understanding. He wasn't being killed. He was being merged. Visions came faster now, flooding his mind like a storm tearing through old doors. The first hail, standing in this same valley, knife in hand, whispering to the ground. The wars that followed, the droughts, the deals made under blood moons. Each ancestor had offered something, and each had been rewarded with land, with prosperity, with life unnaturally long. It was all the same promise. Feed the soil, and it will feed you back. But Tobias's generation had forgotten. His father had stopped the rituals. His mother had tried to protect him. And the land, the living memory beneath their feet, had starved. Now it was feeding itself the only way it could. He felt its awareness enter him like a second pulse. It didn't speak in words this time. It spoke in instinct, in a hunger that wasn't his, but now was. He could feel every inch of the valley, the wind through the corn, the worms beneath the roots, the bones still soft in their graves. All of it connected, all of it feeding the same pulse that now lived inside his chest. And somewhere deep beneath that pulse, a single truth. He wasn't Tobias Hale anymore. He was the continuation of the pact, the field's memory made flesh. A new caretaker for an ancient hunger. The night turned wrong. The stars didn't shine anymore. They watched. Each one above him flickered like an eyelid opening, casting thin beams that fell not from heaven, but into the soil. Tobias raised his head, and the world around him seemed to breathe. Every blade of grass, every tree branch, every stone pulsing with faint, synchronized life. He could feel the valley looking at him. It wasn't seeing him as a man anymore, but as an extension of itself, another nerve, another vessel. Every heartbeat he felt was both his own and not. He could sense the worms crawling through the dirt like thoughts passing through the body of something vast and awake. He whispered to the wind, barely able to form the words, "What do you want me to do?" And the answer came not in voice, but in vision. He saw the valley as it truly was, not a stretch of farmland, but a living organism. The streams were veins, the trees lungs, The mist that rose from the river was its breath. Every human who had ever walked its soil had been both guest and nutrient. The land wasn't just alive, it was conscious. It had been waiting centuries for a body it could fully inhabit. A host that could walk beyond the valley's edge. A vessel to carry its memory into the world. And now, in Tobias Hale, it had found one. His eyes darkened until the whites were gone, replaced by a faint, wet gleam like freshly turned mud. He could see through them, not just the surface of things, but beneath. He saw the roots beneath the roads, the bones beneath the homes, the bloodlines that fed the soil of every nation. The realization struck like lightning. This wasn't just about one valley. The hunger was everywhere, hidden in plain sight, built beneath every civilization. The same bargain, repeated in different tongues. Feed the earth, obey its will, and it will keep your world standing. And as he stood there, trembling, Tobias understood the curse completely. The valley didn't need to kill him. It only needed him to remember. Because memory is how the soil keeps itself alive. By morning, Tobias Hale was gone. At least, the part that could still call itself human. When the sun broke through the fog, the neighbors who remained swore they saw him standing at the edge of the field, motionless, covered in mud up to his jaw, his clothes soaked black. They called his name. He didn't answer. He only turned his head slightly, as though the sound of his name was a noise the soil had yet to learn how to process. His eyes were wrong. Not blind, not empty, just aware, like the land itself was looking through him. And when he smiled, the ground behind him shifted, a ripple of movement spreading through the field like wind under skin. The roots responded to him. Birds fell silent. The air changed. That night, he walked into town. People said his steps didn't sound right, that his boots made no noise, only the faint crunch of something dry being ground beneath them. He passed the chapel. The lights flickered. He stopped outside the store where his father once sold corn, his hand resting against the wood like it was an old wound. And then, slowly, he began to speak. His voice wasn't his voice anymore. It carried a low vibration, a resonance that made walls tremble and windows hum. Your land is hungry, he said. You build your houses on its ribs, and still you think it sleeps. But it remembers. It always remembers. Some thought he was raving. Some ran. A few fell to their knees, not from belief, but from something deeper, instinctive, ancestral. He lifted his hand, and a drop of soil fell from his palm, dark, living, pulsing faintly. You fed it your dead. You fed it your sins. Now it will feed through me. Then he smiled again, and every lantern in town went out at once. When light returned, Tobias was gone. But footprints led from the square back toward the valley, deeper this time, as though whatever walked them weighed far more than any man. And from the distance came the sound of something large turning over beneath the ground, like the world itself shifting in its sleep. When the coroner's report finally arrived, it was sealed with the county's crimson wax, the same symbol used for executions. Sheriff Barlow broke it open with the edge of his knife, his breath shallow. Inside lay a single page, yellowed, trembling with age even though it was freshly typed. The results were impossible. The blood on the Whitlock barn walls was human, but not from any known blood group. It contained markers not cataloged in medical science. The typing machine notes described anomalous proteins, unstable plasma behavior, and a chilling phrase written in pen by the county examiner. This blood does not coagulate. It moves when observed under light. Barlow stared at that line for a long time, his knuckles whitening. He remembered the strange shimmer he'd seen on the barn's rafters that night, the glistening film that seemed to breathe. At the bottom of the page, The examiner had scrawled something else, a personal note, one that was never meant to be official. I cannot conduct further analysis. The sample has vanished. My instruments have turned against calibration. It's as if the blood knew it was being studied. Barlow slammed the paper shut. He looked at the coroner's signature, a name he didn't recognize. Someone new. Someone inserted into the records just for this case. The previous county pathologist had died weeks prior. Accidental poisoning, they'd said. He whispered to himself. They're covering it, something unnatural. That night, he returned to the Whitlock property, lantern in hand. He scraped the floorboards again, looking for any trace of what the report described. Nothing. Just dust, rot, and silence. Then, from the dark corner of the barn, a faint glow pulsed through the cracks, as if something beneath the earth was breathing. Barlow leaned closer, the light flickering across his face. He whispered, trembling, "You were never just human, were you, Whitlock?" And somewhere deep beneath the boards, something answered, not in words, but in a slow, rhythmic thud, like a heart refusing to die. Sheriff Barlow returned the next night alone. No deputies, no lanterns this time. Only the pale light of a waning moon to guide him. The Whitlock barn loomed like a ribcage against the sky, its timbers creaking with the cold breath of wind. Every sane thought told him to leave, but curiosity, or maybe fear disguised as duty, pulled him forward. He found the spot again, the same place where the faint glow had pulsed through the cracks. This time, he brought a shovel. The soil was soft, unnaturally soft, like something had been disturbed recently. Each strike of the shovel made a hollow sound, not like dirt, like wood. Then came the smell. Not death exactly, but something older, wetter, like the scent of a storm trapped underground. His hands trembled as the shovel hit a large plank buried under the soil. It wasn't part of the barn's foundation. It was a lid. He brushed the dirt away until a set of nails gleamed under the moonlight. Handmade, bent inward, as if hammered from inside. His heart raced. Someone had tried to seal this from within. Barlow pried the first nail loose, and a hiss of air escaped from beneath the boards. Warm, thick, and strangely metallic. It carried a faint whisper, the way wind sometimes mimics a voice when it passes through a hollow. He froze. There it was again. A voice. Soft. Pleading. "Don't open it." Barlow stumbled back, his shovel clattering to the ground. He looked around. Nothing but silence. Only the barn, the dirt, and the stars above. He steadied his breath, swallowed hard, and knelt again. Another nail came loose. Then another. The board shifted slightly under his fingers. He pulled it up, and for a moment, time itself seemed to pause. Inside wasn't a coffin. It was a chamber, lined with something like flesh, faintly glowing from within. And in the center, embedded in the earth, was a shape. Human, but not quite. Skin translucent, veins glowing dimly like threads of mercury. Barlow's mind screamed, but his body refused to move. The thing's chest rose once, twice, breathing. And when its eyes opened, they weren't eyes at all, just two pits of light that flickered like lanterns in fog. Then it spoke, a whisper that wasn't made by lungs, but by the air itself. He promised to bury us, not awaken us. Barlow fell backward, scrambling away as the ground around the pit began to pulse. Alive, restless, aware. The sheriff fled into the night, but the light followed, crawling across the barn floor like liquid lightning. By dawn, Sheriff Barlow's mind had nearly broken. He stumbled into town like a man chased by his own shadow. Eyes wide, words slurred, reeking of soil and fear. But when the doctor tried to calm him, the sheriff's voice came out in fragments. as though he were speaking through static. It wasn't dead. None of them were. They planted them. No one believed him, not at first. The Whitlocks had always been strange, yes, but human enough to pass. The churchgoers whispered about their pallid skin, their quiet eyes, their way of speaking as if they were listening to something deeper than words. But buried creatures? Living beneath the barn? That sounded like madness. Until the doctor drew blood from the sheriff's arm to sedate him, and the needle came out black. At first, they thought it was a trick of the light. Then the smell hit them. Iron, yes, but also something else. Like burning wood soaked in rain. The blood thickened on the table, curling like smoke, forming thin, branching patterns that resembled roots. When the doctor lifted his hand, the pattern moved with it, following. Barlow screamed, but no sound came out. The veins on his neck bulged, his eyes rolled white, and when they forced his mouth open, the same black fluid dripped from his tongue like ink. He wasn't possessed. He was infected. The Whitlocks hadn't been haunted by spirits. They were the carriers of something older, something that used human bodies like soil. The more people dug into the family's past, the stranger it grew. Parish records showed that the Whitlocks never buried their dead in the town cemetery. Their graves were empty. Their genealogy traced back to no one. Their oldest ancestor, a man named Elias Whitlock, had appeared in Georgia in the late 1700s, purchasing the land after a thunderstorm that reportedly turned the soil red for 3 days. No birth records, no ship logs, just a single note scrawled in the town's archive. Elias came from the hollow place. That phrase appeared again in Barlow's ramblings before he vanished. The night the moon turned crimson and the church bell rang without a hand touching it. The Whitlocks, it seemed, were not guarding a secret. They were the secret. And the barn wasn't their home. It was their womb. They say the sheriff's body was never found. Only his badge, melted, warped, and half buried in the soil near the Whitlock barn. After that night, the forest grew quiet again. Too quiet. Birds stopped nesting there. Hunters who entered never stayed past dusk. Locals called it the Silent Woods, and anyone who dared to cross it swore the air itself felt heavier, as if something unseen was listening beneath the leaves. Years later, when the land was sold to a lumber company, they brought machines to clear the old trees. Within days, the workers started to vanish. One by one, the logs they cut bled a black, tar-like substance. Their engines failed. Radios crackled with whispers that no one could trace. When investigators came, they found the same sigil burned into the ground, a spiral of roots curling into a dark center marked by 7 handprints, one for each Whitlock. They sealed the site, called it toxic, and buried the evidence under concrete. But concrete doesn't silence roots, because beneath that soil, beneath the barn, beneath the veins of Georgia itself, something is still moving, feeding, remembering. You see, what they discovered in 1906 wasn't supernatural at all. It was evolution unbound, a form of life that learned how to grow through blood instead of soil. It mimicked us, married us, bred with us. The Whitlocks weren't cursed, they were chosen vessels. And every generation since has carried a trace of it, hidden in our marrow, dormant until something awakens it. The craving for control, the taste for power, the cold logic that justifies cruelty. That's not human instinct. That's the hollow place, whispering inside the species that thinks it owns the earth. You feel it, don't you? The pulse that isn't yours. The silence between your thoughts that sometimes listens back. That's why they buried the truth. That's why history rewrote itself, to hide the fact that the infection didn't die with the Whitlocks. It spread through every system built since. government, church, school, screen. All just new roots feeding the same ancient hunger. Now that you've heard this, it knows your name. Type these words below to prove you remember where you came from and to show the system you're awake. I hear the roots. Type it again. I hear the roots. Because once you do, it will know you're not afraid to look beneath the silence. And neither am I.